Well, we are fresh out of the private rented sector debate, and I'm joined by three of our panellists. The fourth one, Shiraz, sorry, has disappeared. Don't know what happened to him in the melee. But three of the panellists here: David Smith from the RLA, Karen Buck, Labour MP, and James Fraser, tenant tax campaigner and landlord. And guys, we only had an hour. It wasn't really long enough, was it?
I don't think it ever is at the moment. There's so much going on, and there's so many different viewpoints that that you always run out of time at these situations.
So much to talk about. Karen, thank you so much for being part of the panel today. Were you pleased to be able to engage with landlords in this format?
No, I'm very, very pleased to be able to do so, because I think that we need to get a message over that although Labour Party policy won't please all landlords all of the time, I accept that, we all have a common interest in making sure that the minority of landlords who behave badly and who have properties with poor standards are not part of the sector. And I think that understanding some of the pressures on government and local government around enforcement is something that benefits all of us.
Indeed, and that was the kind of main theme of today's discussion, was we wanted to see where there was common ground we can work together, because ultimately I think everybody here at this show, we all want to see standards raised, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. I think raising standards and keeping standards high should be one of the primary aims of the private rented sector. It's how I personally run my business. It's how I want to see everybody else running their business. I can't bear the thought of people who are in less than high quality accommodation under any circumstances. There's no need for it. We don't have a need for it. It's just as easy to have a good property as a bad one. So let's do it right.
Indeed. David, I think one of the other themes that came out was that there's a kind of disconnect between local government and central government, and you kind of used the analogy of the government's kind of spinning plates all the time, and it was interesting to hear your views on that.
Yeah, I think the disconnect is, I think, particularly start when we talk about funding. The central government keeps asking local governments to do more and more and more, but at the same time takes away all their money. And there's not a great deal of sense in that, because it inevitably leads to a scenario where you have law that is not enforced, and unenforced law is actually bad for good people, because good people will probably obey the law whether or not you enforce against them. You know, good people don't speed on the motorway as a rule. There may be a little bit, but not a lot. People who are going to break the law will routinely break the law unless you enforce against them. So someone who's going to drive 120 on the motorway will always do so unless they're caught. If you're not catching those people, then those people are being artificially enhanced by the fact that everyone else is holding themselves back, and they make more money, which they shouldn't. They probably don't pay their taxes either, so not only do they make more money, they don't even pay tax on it. And you end up with law that basically penalises good people rather than protecting people from the bad people.
Indeed, and one landlord said that they wouldn't mind paying their licence, their selective licence fee, if they knew that there were enforcement, that the rogues would get caught out. So there's actually not very much incentive for good landlords to pay their licence fees if they know it's not going to be enforced.
Well, I mean, this is always a dilemma, because enforcement is expensive, and the fees are part of what should be contributing towards local authorities being able to enforce, and indeed they are. But it's also against a context where local government has had a nearly halving of its central government grant, and that has fed through into enforcement. I mean, what I didn't say in the seminar was the figure that we often quote, which is only around 1% of all properties that have the equivalent of a Category 1 hazard will have had any enforcement action taken against them. So, we know there is an enormous pool of poor properties out there that don't have enforcement. But unfortunately, you can't do this for free. And so either central government funding or fees or fines have to be the way in which this is done.
Karen, you were keen to point out that local authorities, you described it as being, between the devil and the deep blue sea. That they obviously want to house people, but they're very restricted in other ways.
One of the main pressures that local authorities are under, in addition to their own direct funding cuts, is the squeeze that has come on local housing allowances, which means that those people who are most vulnerable, including, though not only restricted to, homeless households, have the least increased choice in their property, and local authorities are increasingly hard-pressed in finding places to put them. Now, this is not in anyone's interest, and at its sharpest, it ends up in universal credit and the delays that landlords here today were talking about, and how that impacts upon their ability to let to people on the lowest incomes. Now, landlords need to have their voices heard very clearly in this and evidenced, so that government has to absolutely understand that in terms of universal credit, it is making a serious mistake, and that mistake is hurting landlords, but in hurting landlords, it is also hurting some of the most vulnerable people there are.
No, totally agree. Jamie, what was the conclusion of our panel? Because we wanted to find that common ground where we could all work together. What can we do as individuals, as a community?
Well, the conclusion I gave in there was actually that we should all keep doing what we're doing. The good landlords, the people who care about their tenants, they care about their properties, keep doing that. Don't give up. Have pride in yourself because you are doing a good job. In addition to that, if you can keep bringing this message to the authorities time and time again, if you can keep separating yourself from the bad landlords who none of us want anything to do with, and keep going with what you are doing, sooner or later, I hope we can win the day and people will understand that we are trying to give a great service and we care very much about it.
Well, I mean, absolutely. The private rented sector is an essential part, a strand of tenure in this country, and will continue to be so. We have an interest in good landlords providing good, decent and affordable property. And I think part of the answer to this is around tackling the rogue end of the spectrum. Some of it is about making sure that tenants are able to pay a reasonable rent and to exercise some choice in where they live, so they are not trapped into the worst conditions. And in my opinion, the private rented sector is not an ideal location for a number of families with children and a number of more vulnerable tenants who are being squeezed into that sector because of the shortfall in social housing. And I think that has to be addressed as well. But the private sector is here to stay as part of the balance of tenures in the country, and that means we have to work constructively with landlords to get the best deal for them and for tenants.
Very well said, thank you. And David, you and I, we would always say not only join one landlord association, perhaps join two.
Well, there's no harm in joining other landlord associations. Obviously, I have to say the Residential Landlord Association is the best one. But obviously, people should consider what the Landlord Association is offering them, and if you feel that there are other things offering other things, you should take that into account. Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all my wonderful panellists. I really do appreciate you taking part today, and also for being part of the interview. We really have got so much ground to cover, but I think it was a very constructive and positive dialogue overall today, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I think it went well. There was a clear appreciation in the room for what was being said, and a clear appreciation in the panel with what was being said from the room. So I think it's important that these things keep happening.
Indeed. Well, thank you all very much. And Karen, good luck with your Homes, Fitness and Habitation Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, nearly at the last hurdle there. So good luck with that. Thank you very much for being part of the conversation today, and to my other panellists as well. Cheers.